A century of movie making has seen its fair share of disastrous films. Movies that cost studios millions, releases that brought careers to an abrupt end. But the most infamous box office bomb in the history of film may just be Michael Cimino's 1980 American epic, Heaven's Gate. It's a movie whose reputation for being a bomb is so notorious that even if you've never seen it, you've probably at least heard of Heaven's Gate. And in the decades since, the ripple effects of Heaven's Gate can be seen in Hollywood for both better and for worse. It's not just that Heaven's Gate was doomed from the start, or that its production was a disaster that became a bottomless money pit, or that it lost millions of dollars at the box office, or that it doomed a director who had found incredible success just a few years earlier, or that it destroyed a studio forever, or that it effectively brought an entire era of movie making to an end. It's that Heaven's Gate did all of that at once, but it's much more complicated than what its reputation would have you believe. It's the tale of egos and visions running wild at the worst time imaginable, and the fallout caused by a mega corporation that permanently changed filmmaking. This is the story of Heaven's Gate, the biggest disaster in the history of film. The story of Heaven's Gate and its impact on filmmaking is deeply entwined with the studio that brought it to life, United Artists. So while this isn't a video all about the entire history of United Artists, it is about the movie that killed it, so a little context is necessary. United Artists Corporation was founded on February 15, 1919 by Charlie Chaplin, D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks, who had by this point each become powerful, successful figures in Hollywood. But in the years before its founding, each had run into mounting frustrations with the state of movie making. Chaplin couldn't get First National Pictures to increase his budgets despite making massive hits for them. Both Pickford and Fairbanks couldn't get new production deals with their studios due to a secret plan to merge multiple movie companies. And Griffith looked for new opportunities for his notoriously expensive films after previous studio partnerships were dissolved. Together, the four founding stars held a 25% stake in the preferred shares and a 20% stake in the common shares of United Artists, making it a true joint partnership, with a pledge to give artists complete control over their work with financial support from the studio. A stark contrast against a newly expanding Hollywood that was transitioning into the period of the studio system. And this was UA's mission for the decades that followed. However, the studio also consistently struggled. I have gone into a lot of this in my previous video on the history of MGM. Go and watch that video for more details. Plug, plug, plug. But in the following 60 years, United Artists would go through continual turnover in its leadership and financial independence. Eventually, United Artists became a publicly traded company in 1957 and found success in the 60s while many other studios floundered, before having 98% of its stock purchased by American holding company Transamerica Corporation in 1967, which had primarily focused on banks and insurance before working to become a massive conglomerate. Listen, this is important, okay? It's not going to work out well. And that brings us to the 1970s and the new Hollywood movement, where young directors and writers shook up the failing studio system with auteur-driven movies that focused on counterculture and taboo subjects. And the 70s were a huge era of success for United Artists, which produced hits like Rocky, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and a lot more under UA president Arthur Krim, who repeatedly and publicly requested that UA be spun off into its own separate company so that they could better succeed and not be weighed down by Transamerica's focus on stocks, which were never impacted by UA's performance, good or bad. But the parent conglomerate repeatedly said no to Krim. Despite their success, Transamerica was angry about the release of X-rated films like Midnight Cowboy and Last Tango in Paris, demanding their names be taken off the films with only United Artists credited, only to plan to eventually completely sunset the UA studio name and make every movie under the Transamerica Films title. But there came a point when enough was enough, and Krim and several other major figures in UA quit the company and founded Orion Pictures in 1978. We'll leave Orion there for another time and another video on the rise and fall of Orion. But this left UA in distress and directionless, as Transamerica gained more control of the studio than ever with newly appointed president Andy Albeck. And so this push and pull between art and commerce in a studio that was founded to specifically embrace the art of film led to Michael Cimino and his dream project of Heaven's Gate. While Cimino first broke into the industry through television ads, he was able to transition into feature films by writing movies like Silent Running, and then both writing and directing Thunderbolt and Lightfoot in 1974. The film's success then led to The Deer Hunter in 1978, a sprawling tragedy about a group of friends torn apart by the Vietnam War that was one of the highest grossing films of the year and won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Even before the Oscar wins, Cimino was massively in demand, and with his newfound clout, he turned to United Artists to finally make a film he had originally written back in 1971, Heaven's Gate. Okay, so with all this back and forth about the lead up to Cimino's film, and already knowing that this all ends in disaster, what is Heaven's Gate actually about? Well, it's a western, it's a tragedy, it's an epic, and it's a partially true story about a very bloody and never really discussed dark period in America's history, the 1892 Johnson County War in Wyoming. Here, the focus is on James Averill, a marshal played by Kris Kristofferson, Nate Champion, an enforcer played by Christopher Walken, and Ellen Watson, a bordello madam played by Isabelle Huppert, who form a love triangle as a war between the poor European immigrants who live in Casper, Wyoming, and the wealthy cattle barons that control the land around them breaks out. It's a conflict ignited by class, money, power, and 2 very opposing interpretations of the American dream, as the cattle barons have 125 of the settlers named as thieves and anarchists for eating their cattle to avoid starving, and plan on killing them for the bounties they've placed on their heads. When the plans are discovered, a bloody and deadly battle breaks out. And yeah, that's actually something that happened in general, and the characters of Averill, Champion, Watson, and many of the other people they come into conflict with were real historical figures, but Cimino's script just kinda has them do a bunch of stuff that never really happened. Champion didn't even know Averill or Watson. Not that historical accuracy is the arbiter of a film's quality, but I find it strange that Cimino chose to tell the story of a little-known conflict in US history, only to just kinda make up a lot of the story. Oh, and it's called Heaven's Gate because that's the name of a roller skating rink where some important decisions are made. I guess it sounds cooler and more intriguing than Johnson County War. As for the cult that all tried to catch a ride on a comet by, dying, I believe they're completely unaffiliated. All these years later, and Heaven's Gate is inextricable from its reputation as a box office bomb. And we'll get into the disastrous production and the many incidents that led to its failure at the theaters. But how is Heaven's Gate as just a movie taken on its own, free from all of that context and its reputation? Well, I would say pretty good, but not great. First of all, the film is incredibly gorgeous. Cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond, who also shot McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Deliverance, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, makes every shot feel lush, soft, full of color, and stunning to look at. One important note here, when the film was originally released, it all had a sepia color grade, making it look like an old photograph, which I'm sure also added to its difficult original reception. But Cimino would later remove the sepia grading when it was released on home video, essentially making the original look into lost media. It wouldn't be the first time huge portions of this movie were lost forever, but we'll get more into that later. To go along with its wonderful cinematography, the sets and locations used for Heaven's Gate are wonderful, and feel really startling at times when you're able to take them all in. Most of the movie was shot in Glacier National Park in Montana, giving the story a backdrop of wide-open, untamed wilderness that's constantly cold instead of the typical Southwest hot setting of the traditional Western. It's a film that bears the marks of massive ambition and studio pushback, but most of that pushback didn't really come until filming was complete, and it's during that shooting that our problems truly began. When United Artists greenlit Heaven's Gate, they agreed to make the film for $12 million. At the time, a really big budget, but not unheard of. Just a few years earlier, the original Star Wars was made for $11 million. But that was a movie filled with super innovative effects, new worlds, and Darth Vaders and stuff. Saying you're going to make a Western for $12 million is kinda nuts. By the time Heaven's Gate was in theaters, accounting for its out-of-control production, numerous re-edits, and marketing, United Artists had spent a total of $44 million. How? Well, when describing the filming of Heaven's Gate years later, Cimino described the process of filming as both a battle and harmonious relationship with nature, embodied by conquering a mountain, saying, "You can have the most beautiful shot lined up, and just the moment you're ready to go with a beautiful backlight, a cloud blocks the sun. The mountain is testing you. See, the mountain knows that time is money and knows you're under pressure. You've got thousands of people, and the clock is ticking, and the mountain is testing you. The mountain is saying, how long can this guy go? Can I break him? Will he tough me out? If you have the guts and you wait, the sun will eventually come out. The mountain says, thank you for respecting me, and he gives you the shot." Yeah, that's a beautiful way of looking at art that coincides and works with nature, and Cimino's film is really working to try and be in harmony with everything around it. It's a beautiful movie to look at. It was a production that tried to coincide with Glacier National Park all around it, and the way that it looks and feels really is the result of that production. But in the context of making a movie that cost tens of millions of dollars to make, it all leads up to disaster. And because of Cimino's approach of making art the way he wanted to make it and when he wanted to make it, production quickly spiraled out of control. One of the best ways to understand the disaster that was the making of Heaven's Gate is with this book, Final Cut by Stephen Bach. He was one of the producers that was in charge of making Heaven's Gate, and it is a really fascinating look at the production of it all, the history of United Artists, and the context of what happened in making this movie and everything that came afterward. But for the sake of my video, its biggest contribution is in better understanding how it all went wrong. Here's one example. According to Bach, at the end of the first 6-day week of shooting, Cimino was already 5 days behind schedule and had spent $900,000 for a minute and a half of usable film. At the end of the second week, he was 10 days and 15 pages behind shooting schedule for 3 minutes of usable film, adding up to $3 million in production costs already. So why didn't United Artists stop him? Well, Cimino essentially had the studio give him complete power through his contract. In it, Cimino said that he would try to get the film completed for its scheduled Christmas 1979 release date, but if he went beyond his $12 million budget, all cost overruns would be paid for by the studio and not be regarded as going over budget. If you trust a director to finish the film with maybe a little flexibility in cost, okay, sure. Maybe take some constraints away if you believe the creator will benefit. Instead, Cimino proceeded to run wild. The cast was trained to roller skate for more than a month. Actors were put in full costume and makeup just to test natural lighting without shooting a thing. Cimino would handpick and arrange extras one by one. Every shot would undergo at least 30 takes each to workshop every mood. The battlefield for the climactic battle was given its own custom irrigation system to grow lush grass. You can't even see it, by the way. The street set was completely built and then torn down and built again to make the gaps between houses 6 feet wider. A vintage train was moved cross-country for a shot, and by all accounts, Cimino became a tyrant on set, firing Willem Dafoe for laughing between takes and holding a loaded gun to Tom Noonan's head during a dispute. How could you do that to Tom Noonan? Eventually, UA fired producer Joan Corelli to regain control of the production, and told Cimino that he would have to stick to his budget and schedule to retain rights to the final cut of the movie. But by then, the damage was done and it was public before the film even came out, with journalist Les Gapay getting a role as an extra for 2 months to get all the scoops he could. His article, Shootout at Heaven's Gate, published in September 1979 for the Washington Post, blew the doors open on the film's hellish production, including many different injuries suffered by extras on set. And from then on, it was damage control and panic for United Artists. Here's the thing, the massive train wreck that was Heaven's Gate didn't simply end when production was finished. After 11 months of filming and 220 hours of footage, Cimino quite literally locked himself away in the editing room to prevent the studio from taking it away from him. It's quite funny, actually, said assistant editor Penelope Shaw. He had bars put on the cutting room windows, and he had all the locks changed so that nobody could come in. He said, "I'm not showing it to them until I'm ready." When Cimino delivered his first cut of the film to the producers, the film came in at a whopping 5 hours and 25 minutes. But not to worry, Cimino said that the film wasn't in its final edited state and that he actually wanted to make the movie a slim 5 hours and 10 minutes long. Yeah, those 15 minutes were really going to make a difference. I think one has to understand what the motives were, said Cimino years later. Is it obscene to spend $30 or $40 million on a blatantly commercial effort whose sole purpose is to make more money? Is that obscene? Well, yeah. But with all that said, I think that Heaven's Gate is a really fascinating movie to watch all on its own. When watching Heaven's Gate, one thing that you can't help but be consistently impressed by is the scale of the production. Every moment of the film plays across enormous, detailed sets with hundreds of extras filling out what often feels like a living, breathing world. Yes, Heaven's Gate is a Western, but I have trouble even calling it that. The thing that the film has most in common with Westerns, beyond its time and place, is that its plot is propelled by conflict over what to do with the newly settled West. But I find this to be more of a romantic drama or a tragedy than a Western. The Wild West is dead. We're decades past the Civil War, and the law and government are much more important here. Really, it's a movie that lacks so much of the Western spirit that by the time the bullets start flying and the bodies start dropping in the third act, it almost feels unnatural. This is a movie about classism in America, about the push and pull between the haves and have-nots, with Cimino taking an obscure conflict in US history and filling it full of fictional personas and moments to emphasize his point that the myth of the Free West was always false. American people to this very day like to say that America is a classless society, said Cimino, and it's totally untrue. America was, is, and will always be, like every society, a system of classes. There was always an upper class, a middle class, a working class, a slave class. They're insisting on creating a myth. I didn't shatter any myth. Heaven's Gate is also filled to the gills with incredible actors, many of whom were just on the cusp of a major breakthrough. It's not just Kristofferson, Walken, and Huppert. We've also got John Hurt, Sam Waterston, Brad Dourif, Jeff Bridges, Terry O'Quinn, and Tom Noonan showing up in all sorts of supporting roles. Even Mickey Rourke and Willem Dafoe are here in brief background pieces before they made it big. And you know what? Whatever you might think about the story and structure of the film, Heaven's Gate is filled with great performances, and a lot of them are understated and play into the gray morality of everything that's going on here, and they act as a stark contrast to the big, bombastic, and sort of thematically massive ways that a lot of Western performances were done in the decades before. In the end, it's hard to say what Heaven's Gate is entirely about beyond puncturing the myth of the American dream and exposing the harsh realities of capitalism, classism, and exploitation that have long been experienced in the United States. In the actual Johnson County War, there wasn't a community of poor, newly arrived immigrants that went to war with the ruling class. Instead, it was an assortment of settlers fighting with cattle barons over public and private property. By turning the protagonists into immigrants and turning Averill into their well-educated champion, Averill and Watson were not well-educated or a bordello madam and were falsely accused of cattle rustling and executed years before the conflict came to a head. Cimino's story becomes a narrative about the two sides of America at war with each other, and Averill becoming a tragic hero doomed to live a long and lonely life. The long arc of Cimino's film is the dissolution of dreams, love, and hope, with its ultra-violent climax being a whirlwind of ugly, brutal death that is ultimately for nothing. No one wins, no justice is found, and in the shortened version, Watson and Bridges are killed in an ambush, and we flash forward to Averill alone on his yacht decades later, miserable, all in the last 5 minutes. The end. Yeah, I can see why this movie left a sour taste in the mouths of audiences and critics at the time, because even though I'm more positive on the film, it really falls apart at the end. But that version is the shortest cut of the film. Originally, Cimino and UA agreed on a 3-hour and 37-minute cut of Heaven's Gate, and this is the version of the film that first premiered on November 19, 1980. And after years of pain and endless battles, Cimino's film was met with a premiere audience that hated him, a general public that didn't want to see it, and critics that savaged it, with Vincent Canby, lead film critic of the New York Times, writing that the movie fails so completely that you might suspect Mr. Cimino sold his soul to the devil to obtain the success of The Deer Hunter, and the devil has just come around to collect. Just a few weeks later, UA pulled the movie out of theaters and forced Cimino to re-edit it. We believe that Heaven's Gate is going to be an excellent film in its shortened version and that it has tremendous worldwide commercial potential, said Andy Albach, president of United Artists. The new version, coming in at 2 hours and 29 minutes, is much more commercially viable, but it's a total mess. Character arcs make no sense, plots rush along, and you just get completely lost in what people are doing, where they are, and why they're even doing what they're doing. The scope of Cimino's massive film is absolutely shattered, and while I don't think that the 3.5-hour cut of this movie is some hidden masterpiece, it all makes a lot more sense and is doing what Cimino intended for this movie to do. The thing is, once Heaven's Gate was savaged in the New York premiere, the film and United Artists as a whole was already doomed. On November 24, 1980, Transamerica announced they had established a cash reserve against the losses that were likely going to be caused by Heaven's Gate. This cash reserve was then placed on United Artists, meaning that while Transamerica was set to make about $4 billion in revenue from insurance, manufacturing, financial services, and more, with movies only a small fraction, a total of $44 million of debt caused by Cimino's movie would be written off as a loss against United Artists, forcing the studio to bite the bullet so that the larger corporation wouldn't have its stocks negatively affected. Sucks, right? It's a lot like what happened to Toys R Us decades later, with a private equity firm moving all of their debt onto that toy store so they could make as much money as possible and be free of financial ties. Movies, toys, and happiness aren't much of a concern to investors that are looking to squeeze as much money out of anything they have. By the end of its second theatrical run, which began on April 24, 1981, and only lasted a month in the days when a successful film could be in theaters for a year, Heaven's Gate had made only $1.3 million. Compare that to the biggest films of 1980, The Empire Strikes Back, 9 to 5, Stir Crazy, and Airplane, which made hundreds of million dollars each and were all as far removed from the auteur era as possible. In just a few short years and a whole lot of bad publicity, United Artists had gone from one of the most important studios of the 70s to essentially dead in the water with an owner that didn't want anything to do with it. And alongside their end came the death of the new Hollywood era, replaced by the era of blockbusters making hundreds of millions on widely appealing event-type cinema. And with the studio on its last legs, that brings us back to the century-long fall of MGM and its on-again, off-again, on-again, off-again, on-again owner Kirk Kerkorian, who purchased United Artists for $380 million, said by many to be way too much, and merged to form MGM UA in May of 1981. For their part, the long and storied history of UA meant that the merger brought 900 movies into the MGM library, including the James Bond and Rocky properties, and made the ever-growing catalog into a truly astonishing collection. The decades that followed saw United Artists at times playing as the stronger half of the duo, at other times playing the weaker half. But in any case, the United Artists that Hollywood knew for more than half a century was gone. First merged with a gutted studio that had lost its glory, then losing all of its back catalog of movies to the Turner Entertainment Company, which eventually led to Warner Brothers being in possession of them, and soon Paramount, and finally being purchased by Amazon to form Amazon MGM Studios, with United Artists functioning as a small banner under the newly merged studio. As for Heaven's Gate, well, in the nearly half-century since it came out, Cimino's film has sort of become code for a passion project by a director and a writer whose budget spirals out of control and is seemingly headed for disaster. Years later, Dances with Wolves was given the nickname Kevin's Gate when it seemed as if Kevin Costner's ego and massively expensive production was headed toward disaster, only for it to turn it all around when it was actually a big box office smash and won a ton of awards. As for Cimino himself, the director's career never recovered. The director had intended to follow up Heaven's Gate with another Western called Conquering Horse, adapted from the novel of the same name and focused on Native Americans on the Great Plains as part of his two-picture deal with United Artists. UA, for their part, didn't really want to work again with the man that sunk their studio. Deal be damned. Eventually, Cimino would go on to make Year of the Dragon for the newly formed MGM UA and a few other small crime dramas in the years to come, only making 5 more feature films, with the last coming in 1996, 20 years before his passing at the age of 77. They're a far, far cry from the enormous, sweeping epics of The Deer Hunter and Heaven's Gate, and clearly the result of no studio ever entrusting him with even a fraction of the budget or control he once had. The new Hollywood era was over forever, and Cimino, one of its poster boys, had killed it. The decades that followed quickly passed the director by, with Cimino becoming an infamous recluse, the subject of constant rumors, and known as the Howard Hughes of Hollywood. And I don't mean because the guy liked to fly planes. He went from a big Oscar film to suddenly being a pariah. Everybody's whipping boy, said Christopherson. Everybody who didn't get to do a film blamed Heaven's Gate, saying all the money went to Heaven's Gate. In the decades that followed, there have been many films that were much bigger bombs than Cimino's film, but these have all come in a time when no studio could be destroyed by a single movie. And while you'd think that the lessons learned from Heaven's Gate would teach studios about what to avoid in filmmaking, Cimino's movie will always, whether it deserves it or not, remain a monument to the damage created by ego, ambition, and money in Hollywood. Thanks for watching today's video, and after a little bit of time away of doing videos like this, I thought it was time to both talk about a failure of a film behind the scenes and some production hell, as well as the fall of a studio. And when you talk about Heaven's Gate, you get 2 for 1. As I talked about in the video, Heaven's Gate is notorious for being a massive box office bomb, maybe the most famous of them all for anyone that knows Hollywood history, as well as one that completely reshaped the course of movie making in Hollywood. And of course, when you talk about Heaven's Gate, you have to talk about United Artists. Now, I previously talked a little bit about UA in my video on MGM, but I did want to go more into the studio's history here. As far as talking about the entire rise and fall of United Artists, I don't think I'll be doing a video like that anytime soon, as I feel like I really got to the core of the issue here with talking about the impact of Heaven's Gate. There are plenty of other studios to talk about when it comes to those sorts of things, and I do want to focus on the history of the James Bond franchise one day, which will intersect with UA plenty. And like I mentioned in the video, I do want to talk about Orion Pictures at one point and give that its own video, because I think that Orion is a studio that a lot of people are somewhat familiar with, especially when you're talking about like sci-fi movies from the 80s, but I don't see it talked about a lot as an entire history of a studio. I really enjoyed digging into the history of Heaven's Gate here, and like I mentioned, the book Final Cut by Stephen Bach was really great in better understanding its creation and its failure. And to make this video, I rewatched the movie 3 times. I first saw it last year in its shortened version, then I saw its shortened version again, and finally I saw the 3.5-hour cut when researching this video. So I'm pretty familiar now with this movie, and I can say that it's good, not great, and still pretty flawed in any version of it. It's just a movie that didn't quite do what it was supposed to do, both just as a piece of art and financially at the box office. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Heaven's Gate if you have seen it, other box office bombs that you would like for me to talk about, other studio histories that you want me to cover in a video, and any other franchises that you'd like for me to cover this year. It's still early in 2026 at the time of this video's premiere, and I have a lot of plans, but they are always loose and in flux as the year goes on. As always, a huge thank you to my members and patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and watching a movie that failed at the box office and making up your own mind whether it's any good or not.